right, so here we are. It is almost the end of the year, and one of the biggest things that's been happening as we start to see our elections unfold, one thing specifically here in Florida, along with some states that we've also followed over the years on the West Coast, is that Florida is now moving to a $15 an hour minimum wage. Now, what does that mean for the restaurant industry? We're going to dive deep into this today. My name is Paul Barron, and this is the Barron Report. All right, so you operators, all of you are kind of faced with a new challenge other than COVID and all the things that are happening in our pandemic that's hit the industry. Now we're really faced with a challenge of dealing with our new onboarding labor pool, whether it's expanding, contracting, still yet to be seen as the market kind of unfolds and demand starts to shift from the consumer side. So I decided to get one of our experts on that I think that kind of runs the gambit in terms of understanding where this market is going, but also how the effect of a $15 an hour wage could either help or hinder the restaurant industry. I want to welcome Don Fox, CEO of Firehouse Subs.
Great to be with you, Paul.
Nice to see you. Very, very sharp. You're looking dapper there today.
Well, thanks. Brought my Firehouse red. We're
I
ready
like
to
that
go.
Firehouse red. You're definitely in uniform. I like it. So we're catching you in Jacksonville, Florida today, and great to see you there. Don, obviously, the Amendment 2, the ballot hit 60% of state voters last week that voted for approving this amendment, which essentially our current wage, minimum wage, $8.56 an hour, moving up to September or to $15 an hour by September 30th, 2026. That's kind of the baseline for this. It doesn't necessarily, I won't get into the change of how it's going to deal with tipped workers and all that. I really want to focus in on the minimum wage increase because it does start fairly quickly here. Firehouse Subs is one of those chains that is a great entry point for a restaurant worker. First-time job, you're maybe just getting into the industry and you're really starting to learn the ropes. How's this going to affect companies like Firehouse Subs?
Well, the number one thing it's going to do is create inflation in the menu. The most substantive increase is the first one, on a percentage basis, going up to $10. I should preface this by saying, well, I can speak definitively for Firehouse. We typically aren't hiring people at minimum wage as it is, and hiring closer to the $10 mark now to attract good talent. And I would say that even extends into people having their first job. There are always a lot of talking points and legitimate talking points about how increasing the minimum wage substantially will hurt, perhaps disproportionately, entry-level workers, youth, teenagers, in particular coming in. So if you're going to pay a lot higher wage, the supposition is that you're going to then bring in different talent. And again, I think there is some truth to that. But at least speaking about Florida's situation, going from where we are now to the $10 mark, it's about a 17% increase in the wage rate. It'll have, I would say, some modest effect on that. I don't think a heavy impact on, let's say, the youth employment factor. The number one place it's going to impact it is menu pricing. People operators are just, if you can't pick up efficiency and productivity to offset it, because most people, the restaurant industry as it is generally doesn't enjoy tremendously healthy margins. The average restaurant in the United States, according to the National Restaurant Association, is 5% pre-tax profit. That doesn't leave you a lot of wiggle room. You take that substantive of an increase in your payroll cost. If you were, let's assume for a moment that you're flowing through at 17% across your entire payroll structure. If you can't cut hours, increase productivity, which is what that amounts to, you've got to increase prices if you're going to remain whole. So we'll no doubt see that.
So pricing, and I think a lot of consumers may not necessarily understand the flow-through effect this has on small business. What you just said, I think, is spot on in terms of inflation. And I guess that's the question because, there are arguments in the industry that unit economics are starting to shift. obviously those companies that have long-term leases
Yeah.
have shifted, even though they have shifted their model. I know with Firehouse, you guys have, most of your units have pretty decent dining rooms. And when you look at kind of the evolution of where real estate's going to go, along with, which is your other controllable there, along with food costs, when you look at that, do you think the consumer is going to be expecting this change coming? Because I think most consumers might look at it, hey, it's actually costing a restaurant operator less money to
Well,
operate today.
I think those other
What are your thoughts there?
those other factors that you mentioned, though, real estate, for example, that's not gonna manifest itself in any real world savings anytime soon. Everybody that
Exactly.
has their real estate situation is embedded in it. I mean, the vast
Yep.
majority of the operators that are there, those that survived the pandemic, you're operating, you have your footprint. Few instances where anybody's going to be able to get economy there in some way. The only way they could is if they're actually end up negotiating lower rent in this environment, and there's no signs
Yeah.
of that happening
Yeah.
anytime soon. So I think for the majority of operators, their other costs will basically be status quo. Wages will rise. They're going to have to take the increase. I think
Yeah.
consumers will understand it, just as they've understood it in other regions of the country where there's
Yeah.
higher minimum wage, different
Yeah.
implementation schedules and timeframes. Probably no two sets of minimum wage stories are equal. But I think that in the end, there has to be a recognition that the consumer has a finite amount of money they're willing to spend on dining away from home.
Sure. Yeah.
And if inflation in the restaurant industry, or let's say we're talking about in Florida, if inflation in the restaurant industry in Florida outpaces general inflation,
Exactly.
then you're going to something's got to give. You're just going to have less traffic. If I could get into a long academic discussion about whether or not increases in minimum wage end up benefiting anybody. You can make a case for minimum wage increasing the cost of goods of things that the people on the lower rungs of the economic ladder disproportionately use.
Right. Yeah.
So they end up
Which
on the
is,
losing side of the inflation equation. So I think what history is pretty well proven out, and you can get various studies from both sides of the ledger, but it's not until it's in place and you really see where the real inflation shakes out in the totality, because minimum wage obviously just doesn't impact inflation in the restaurant industry. It's going to cut across other segments, both in the profit and nonprofit world, by the way. These minimum wage increases are as devastating to nonprofit organizations as they are to for-profit academia and so on. Same thing with when you get back on the discussion of from a couple of years ago on salary increases. That was going to be devastating for the nonprofit world. It just ends up playing out in the real world, and inflation is inevitable. It's just a matter of how much, and then does it cut into traffic? I think within Florida, much was made about the $15 level, which, of course, isn't reached until 2026. So I think everybody's focus and planning and concentration is going to be on the first most onerous increase on a percentage basis. With every subsequent year, it's $1 lift per year. It's on a larger base, so on a percentage basis, it becomes a slightly diminishing percentage increase each year. Still much higher than what it was obviously going to be before on the old formula, based on consumer price index. And then we get to 2026 with that last increase. If everything stays status quo, then we go on with a CPI type calculation. But all of those elements, really, I think realistically, nobody's planning for those. Nobody's really going to be looking much beyond this first increase, which doesn't come until September. And frankly, especially in the age of COVID, that is a lifetime away. In terms of all the variables that are going to that everybody's going to face on the road to recovery between now and then.
Yeah. Well, I definitely think you're correct when it comes to the impact, kind of this trickle down effect that a lot of people may not necessarily understand in terms of how it does affect the actual population that is coming into the market. And with the event of technology being implemented, obviously because of the current condition of our economic situation here in the restaurant industry, that's changing very dramatically and very quickly. With that, also you're changing the dynamic of how consumers are getting the product, meaning do you need as many front counter workers, as many people to help front of house? Now it's more back of house, those kind of things. So productivity is going to be a huge
Yep.
factor. Do you feel like so you had mentioned that Firehouse is already above the minimum wage as it currently is to gain access to these higher quality workers. Now with something going to $10 an hour, do you feel like even though that's jumping, it's $1.50 an hour, almost immediately, but to be able to keep the edge, will a company like yours need to go to $11 an hour at that period to be able to
Yeah.
get that new quality worker?
I suspect not, that for a starting wage. The main issue I think that's going to come into play and that will make things competitive for labor is what happens with your existing staff that are above that level.
Yeah.
There's theories out there that talk about, well, when you raise it to 10, and if you've got someone at 10 now, are you raising them up
Are
to
you going to raise them now?
1150
Yeah.
and on and up the cycle? Depending on the type of restaurant concept that you have, when you get this type of an increase, you will have situations with some brands or independents where hourly team members are now running a very tight margin, if you will, of income differential between the lowest level of management. Shift leads, some of those people currently, perhaps are on hourly management structure. You get this potential compression in
Yeah.
wages. And so I think some of the most difficult decisions that operators are going to have is, to what extent does that increase roll up?
Yeah.
Some operators, depending on their P&L and their appetite for raising prices, there may be some very candid discussions in some restaurants. I'm not talking specifically about Firehouse, keeping this very, very general across the industry.
Yeah.
Some very
Absolutely.
candid conversations with staff about managing their expectation. I vividly recall a focus group that I did with some of our employees in our company-owned restaurants. It's been a while. It was about 6 or 7 years ago, and it was in conjunction with some things I was doing as we were planning for the implementation of the Affordable Care Act. And I was involving our hourly employees in that discussion and the planning and the programs we were putting together to roll out insurance to our full-time hourly employees. We had not done that before, so I embraced that, and we began offering insurance. But in the midst of those discussions, I recall we got into a sidebar about minimum wage. And I think it was because at the time there was some more talk at the national level of not 15 at the time, but it might have been the $10.
Yes.
But I'll never forget a young team member this actually raised my faith in work ethic. He was saying that how unfair it was that after he had worked so hard to get his hourly wage to where it was, that somebody else walking in and was all of a sudden going to be hired in at a higher rate that was so close to where he was at. He sensed the fundamental unfairness in it. Because it was theoretical at the time, talking about what would happen with a federal minimum wage going up. And, I was candid with him and said, look, we probably wouldn't be in a situation where, don't assume you're going to get a $2.75 lift going from $7.25 to a $10, et cetera. So sometimes the team members understand the dynamics a lot better than people give them credit for. Just like I know we weren't going to talk as much, I think, about the tipped wage component, but certainly employees in the industry understand the dynamics with tip wage and how, especially the better the server you are, the more that works against you to see increases or situations where the tip wage has to equal minimum wage. And all too often, not enough credit is given to the team members for understanding that dynamic and how that can work against them.
Do you think that when you look at this, because whether you're an independent operator or someone that falls under a brand operation like Firehouse Subs, when you look at this, do you feel like operators are just simply going to have to get much more, they're just going to have to filter out a lot more quality out of the hiring process to be able to maintain, because the likelihood is you're going to have someone in there that's going to have, one, a lot more experience with the capability of handling some productivity, contribution to the business. With that, do you feel like we could see a little bit of a fallout of just not as many people being employed in the same unit counts out there from whether it's an independent or a chain?
If I think out of necessity, you're going to see some reduction in workforce.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a variety of ways to try to deal with the increased cost, and there won't be one prescribed way.
Right.
Competition will play a key role in it.
Yeah.
Depending on the segment that you're in, and again, how much price elasticity you do or don't have. Some types of concepts are going to be able to avail themselves of more automation, if you will, or it was a very interesting example. Chipotle just announcing that they were going to an all-digital location.
Right. Yep.
So not having cashier staff. Does every concept have the capacity to do that? The willingness? Do the consumers have the appetite for that type of service? I mean, there's a lot of things to be discovered there. But again, different brands are going to have more opportunity than others. Independents, different opportunities than others. And I have no doubt, well, I can guarantee you this, there's no situation where people's hours are getting, collectively, that more people are employed.
Yeah.
or the more hours. So it's only, and it's not staying status quo. There's no scenario there. So it's only a matter of how much decreased opportunity there is, just a matter of degree. And I'm not smart enough to be able to predict that. But I can accurately predict it's going to go down. There will be people that lose their jobs. There are people that are going to lose their hours.
Yeah.
And it just remains to be seen where it's to what level.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's the thing. When we've done some study on some of the states that have actually implemented $15 hour minimum wage, mostly on the West Coast. I won't go into the detail of it, but the basis of the study was to look at the transaction count when we look at what we do on Foodable Labs, to really listen to how consumers are going in and whether or not consumer transactions counts were lifting or going down over that period of time, over the past couple of years when these implemented changes have taken place. And what we've seen is that prices on the menus have gone up, sometimes fairly significant in some markets, I mean, versus what you've seen in previous price increases. And the transaction counts are going down. So that means a complete change in the business model. In some cases, you're going from maybe a $1.4, $1.5 million store to a 1.3, which changes your staff requirement and many other unit economics within that, as well as trickle down on all sorts of related industries.
To give you a theoretical, I'm going to exaggerate the numbers to make the point.
Okay.
So if I have a basis of $100, and I increase prices 50%, right? But my traffic goes down and offsets it. So let's say at the end of the day, I'm bringing in the same sales dollars, or even marginally improve it.
Yep.
But I've got such greatly diminished transactions that I just don't need the labor.
Need the help.
Period.
Yes.
None of us are paying people to stand around and do nothing.
Right.
And it's simply a matter of the need for labor, and it'll suppress it. But generally, what happens is it's I think pretty rare for a restaurant, or frankly any type of business. If you take any type of extraordinary price increase, your price elasticity kicks in. You're normally you're going to get some decrease in demand, unless you're in you have the good fortune to be in some segment of the economy
Yeah.
where demand is so great that people are willing to pay anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that certainly is not the case for the restaurant industry. We can rule ourselves out of that scenario altogether.
Right. With the Florida Restaurant and Lodging Association, they kind of put out their statement and their position, which is somewhat against this move. And obviously now it's kind of over. But your thoughts on how their positioning of because I'm hearing this from both sides. We when we reached out to you, we also reached out to many others to talk about both sides of the argument.
Yep.
Is this good for the industry or is it bad for the industry? I'm seeing about equal here on good for labor, good to help prop up other aspects of social standing within our communities, all those kind of arguments, and then the core business argument, which is less volume, less jobs, those kind of things, and that's kind of where FRLA has stood. Do you feel like there is any chance that the government here within the state of Florida could see a backlash from this in the coming years and ever reposition this? I mean, they're one of those states that could pull something like that.
Boy, that question really addresses much more than the restaurant industry. I mean, you're really talking about what happens in the overall economy
tourism
in Florida,
overall.
which Florida has been a fantastic overall environment for companies to come and invest. It's a great tourist attraction because there's economy for people coming here. The theme parks maybe have a reputation for being expensive, seeing inflation on entry admission fees and so on. But generally, people coming to the state, whether it's hotel expenses, lodging expenses, on the broader level, certainly dining expenses, other types of attractions. People can come to Florida, have a very, very affordable vacation.
Right.
And this type of move will create, you're just going to see higher pricing across
the board.
Attractions,
hospitality, doesn't matter.
Right, across the board. And to the extent, but then it's a competitive thing. It then is going to be a matter of, how does Florida stack up as far as a destination versus other parts of the country? I mean, fortunately, you can't tax the sunshine. So people won't pay more for that. They'll come here to enjoy it. And as long as the weather and the beaches and those natural attributes of Florida that make it such a great tourist destination, if I'm speaking on behalf of the Florida Chamber of Commerce, which I'm not, if I'm the governor of Florida drumming up tourism, I'm preaching about those things and keeping my fingers crossed that the inflationary impact it will happen. The inflationary impact here doesn't make it that onerous or put us in a less competitive position from a tourism standpoint.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so I think the points are clear. I think to operators, whether we're kind of adapting and we still have a little bit of time here, less than a year now, before we start to see these changes implemented. Hopefully, we won't see any more craziness within our current conditions within our restaurant industry, because it's pretty dire out there and for a lot of these independent brands as we move forward. Don, when you look at the state of the industry as it is right now, there's a lot of shifts that are starting to happen within, especially in fast casual. The category is exploding with a lot of different innovation. There's everything from what you see companies like Reef and Zool doing with these centralized kitchens. You see third parties going public more and more. You see all these kind of technology advancements happening around the central element of food. What are your thoughts on where fast casual is going to be going in the next few years with the current state? Because listen, $10 an hour to $15 an hour, now you're in right smack dab middle of the fast casual worker field. How do you see that evolving out for the industry itself?
I think given all the things you said, but how they converge with the impact of COVID. I think the impact of COVID, the long-term impact of COVID, I say long term, I'm talking in the 2 to 3 year, maybe up to 5 year range. I think it's going to have a lot of bearing on this because, and we don't, I don't think anybody can say with certainty where the restaurant industry is going to net out on unit count and just call it competitive posture.
Right, right.
Um, I don't think that we've hit the bottom of the trough yet. Restaurant counts have fallen. I've seen no
Would
evidence
agree.
yet that that's flattened, or at some point it'll start to rise. That's the nature of
Sure.
this industry. This industry is built on a spirit of there always being room for another great restaurant,
Yeah.
always. But everybody in an industry that everybody is known for a long time is overpenetrated,
Yeah.
overbuilt.
Yeah.
So now you have COVID has greatly impacted that. Don't know where it's going to settle, but think about it for a moment. If we are down some 50 to 100,000 units in the industry, and let's assume a base of about 675,000, maybe 700,000
Right.
of your traditional restaurants. You hear varied counts for varied places, but I
Yeah.
typically think 675 to 700 as far as the more traditional definition of restaurants across all the categories. Yeah, so you chop off 10, 15% of that. Think about what that does in terms of these other issues that we talked about,
Right.
especially supply and demand of restaurants.
Yep.
Right now,
Yep.
even though the restaurants count down is down, the whole supply and demand equation is turned on its head. If demand were at pre-pandemic levels with this restaurant count, boy, would all restaurateurs be doing fantastic and absorbing that
Exactly.
volume. In fact,
Yeah.
if that were the case, you'd have the capacity that would be a factor that would offset some of the wage issues that we've talked about,
Exactly.
or even
Right. Right.
with higher unit volumes and greater flow through that restaurants would have, they'd be in a position to deal with the price increases better. But that's not the world that we're in. That's why it's so difficult to even plan for September on this minimum wage, because we don't
Right.
know where the settling point is. We don't know where it is on a competitive standpoint, how the consumers want to use food. We don't know. Our brand was, I've talked about this on a lot of occasions. I've spoken to you about it before. We had already been on this steady decline in dine-in business.
Yeah.
And right before the pandemic, we were at 37% dine-in after having and worked our way down from a peak of 53% at the end of 2012, and steady but accelerating actually heading into 2020. And then with the pandemic, we went to zero. I often laughed about this. I used when I would talk to my franchisees, and for years, last several years, talking about this decline, and I would somewhat jokingly at the time say, "Well, it's not like it's going to go to zero." It went to zero on March
Yeah.
16th. Dining room business went to zero for Firehouse subs,
Yeah.
and now we're coming back. Right now we're at 11% business in the dining room. I don't think we're ever going to go back up to the 37% that we were right before the pandemic.
Right.
But it is a critical, and this is the same for all brands. I don't think anybody can say with any certainty, once things, whatever normalized even means, what's the composition of your business going to be? How can you then, you have to be able to plan your technology around wherever that normalization is. One thing that I think is absolutely clear is that you can't force on the customer technology or a mode of business that they don't want to use.
Right.
That's why I think it's so fascinating to watch what Chipotle is about to do in this one unit. I think
Gonna be
back to a couple
interesting.
years ago when Shake Shack tried to go cashless, fail,
Backfire. Yeah. Big backfire.
and so yeah, and so I've emphasized this a lot within our team. Where we still have to be in this state where we are very nimble, where we have our ear to the ground on data all the time, where I mean on a week by week basis that we're watching all the cues and behavior. And we're doing I think a very good job going into 8 to 9 months on this, understanding the trigger points and what changes consumer behavior week to week, given what's in the news, what's going on with COVID,
Right.
et cetera. But even with all that learnings, again, still can't predict where it's gonna net out.
Yeah.
And again, I'm focusing back on the Florida minimum wage for a moment. Again, not knowing where we're going to be for sure in September, Let me I'll paint this scenario for you. And I don't know what the closure numbers have been in Florida in terms of total restaurants down, but I'll use a hypothetical. Let's say come September when minimum wage goes up, we're in a situation where unit counts in the restaurant industry in Florida are down 15%.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if that's the case, it just stands to reason there will still be a significant amount of unemployment
Right.
in the million or so people that were in the hospitality industry here.
Right, for sure.
And that will have a very direct bearing in terms of who's looking for those $10 an hour entry jobs.
Yeah, it's going to be harder to get.
That may be the key factor that keeps youth out of the marketplace again, because you're just with the overall unemployment situation. You're
Yeah.
you're going to have people now on the flip side. If we've had a recovery where restaurants of the lion's share have reopened, and restaurants aren't at full capacity, let's say, maybe in some cases because more have opened than there is demand for, it's going to make it that's going to make it on the one hand can make it a tougher market for
Right.
it may be a little counterintuitive. It can be a tougher market for employees in that
Yeah.
situation because you have more options, more places to go to work. But
Well,
bottom line, there's just so many unknowns. It's tough to
yeah.
plan for September.
Yeah, and Florida is, I mean, just the data and numbers that we've continued to track, we're in the top 5 in terms of the most down units. Obviously, we should be. We had one of the top 5 in most units out there, so obviously our exposure is much greater. So it's definitely going to happen. Now, whether or not we can bring that many units back, I just don't know, because we had a very large base of independent restaurant operators that have pretty much spun out here in the state of Florida, which obviously affects a lot of entry-level workers, which is going to open up some very interesting areas for, whether it's small chains or big chains like yourself that do have a large unit count or footprint here within the state. It's going to kind of change the dynamic there. So listen, there is a ton that's going to be happening over the next 6 to 12 months. We definitely want to have you back on the show and continue this discussion as we see kind of the evolution of where minimum wage here in the state of Florida is going to go. Obviously, we're seeing this in other parts of the country, but more importantly is kind of the recovery of the industry itself. So thanks for stopping in on the show today. We appreciate it.
Always my pleasure, Paul. Thanks a lot.
Absolutely. All right, you guys listening in, maybe over on Spotify, tune in, maybe even our new options that you can get to on Amazon Music. You can now catch this show over there. Make sure and leave a rating. That's one of the ways we get feedback from you, and we'd love to hear from you. Also, if you have an idea for the show, just send it to producer@foodabletv.com, and you can hit me up on @PaulBaron at Twitter for any kind of direct communication if you have some stuff you'd like to chat about. Thanks for watching another great episode here on The Baron Report.